You probably don't remember the moment it happened, the moment you decided, without knowing it, that it was safer to feel nothing than to feel too much. Somewhere along the way, your warmth, your joy, your sensitivity became liabilities, and so you learned to shut down. People may call you cold or distant now. They might say you're detached, hard to read, or emotionally unavailable. But they're wrong about you. You're not cold. You're defended. You're protected. And that protection, it was learned, crafted carefully over time by a version of you who didn't have another choice. Carl Jung believed that what we repress doesn't disappear. It lives on in the unconscious, shaping our thoughts, relationships, and even our sense of self. Emotional numbing, then, isn't the absence of emotion. It's the over-control of emotion. It's the psyche's attempt to survive in a world where feeling once brought pain, disappointment, or betrayal. So instead of rage, you offer silence. Instead of tears, composure. Instead of connection, withdrawal. It looks like indifference on the outside, but inside there's a storm that was never allowed to be seen. This video isn't about breaking you down or exposing your defenses. It's about honoring them, and then gently asking why they're still necessary. We'll explore the deep psychology behind emotional freezing, the archetypes that shaped your coping, and the path back to the parts of yourself you had to bury, not because you're weak, but because you were too strong for too long. And now you're tired of being numb, tired of being misunderstood, and ready, maybe for the first time, to remember who you were before the world told you to shut down. So let's begin. Not with shame or blame, but with understanding. You are not broken, you are not heartless, and you are certainly not cold. You just learned to survive in the only way you could. But now survival is no longer enough. It's time to feel again. It's time to come home to yourself. When people say someone is cold, what they often fail to ask is why. Emotional coldness is rarely a natural disposition. It's almost always a response, a learned adaptation to repeated pain, disappointment, or emotional overwhelm. Jung understood that our defenses are not flaws, but survival strategies created by the psyche to preserve the self when life becomes too threatening. Emotional freezing, like the body's physical response to danger, is the mind's way of hitting pause. It numbs the heart when feeling becomes unsafe, overwhelming, or confusing. And over time, this protective shutdown can begin to masquerade as personality. You start to believe that being distant or aloof is who you are, but it's not. It's who you became to survive something that hurt too much to face. Imagine a child who reaches out for love and doesn't receive it, not once, but over and over. The mind of that child begins to form a belief, often unconscious. If I stop needing love, I won't feel this pain anymore. That belief becomes armor, and the armor becomes identity. You stop expecting warmth. You learn not to ask for it. Eventually, you stop offering it too. Not because you're unkind, but because it feels unsafe. The tragedy is that this emotional freeze can harden into the very thing that keeps love out, even when it finally becomes available. People who care about you might misread your silence. They might call you emotionless. But what they don't see is that your silence is the sound of years spent trying to protect something incredibly tender inside you. The emotional freeze isn't a flaw in your wiring, it's a scar. It's evidence that you once felt so deeply that the only way to keep going was to stop feeling entirely. Jung would call this a shadow formation, a part of the self that had to be repressed in order for the ego to maintain control. You didn't want to become numb, you had to, and that's a critical distinction, because when you realize this, you stop seeing yourself as defective and start seeing yourself as intelligent, a survivor. This shift in perspective is powerful. It allows you to hold your emotional distance with compassion rather than shame. And from that space of compassion, healing becomes possible. Here's the truth. What looks like coldness on the outside is often a soul in hibernation, not dead, just dormant, waiting for safety, waiting for a signal that it's okay to come back to life. That signal doesn't come from others, it comes from you, from the quiet decision to stop abandoning yourself, from the courage to feel what was once unbearable, from the recognition that your detachment served you, but it no longer has to define you. Jung taught us that healing begins when we make the unconscious conscious. And when you begin to see your emotional freeze for what it really is, a brilliant but temporary adaptation, you start to unthaw, slowly, gently, on your own terms. And in that thawing, your true self begins to return. There was likely a time in your life when warmth felt like an open door, and that openness got you hurt. Maybe you reached out emotionally and were met with coldness. Maybe you were laughed at when you cried, ignored when you needed comfort, or punished for being sensitive. Jung believed that early wounds shape the architecture of the psyche, and when a child learns that vulnerability leads to pain, the psyche responds by building walls. This is not weakness, this is strategy. A child who learns that warmth invites betrayal learns to trade it for numbness, because numbness, while empty, feels safer than heartbreak. You didn't stop being warm. You buried your warmth because, somewhere along the way, it became dangerous to let anyone see it. Think back. How often did your emotions get you in trouble? How many times did your openness get you rejected or shamed? Over time, your subconscious linked vulnerability with risk, so you began to wear masks, the strong one, the distant one, the unbothered one. These personas aren't lies, they're shields. Jung wrote extensively about the persona, the social face we wear to survive in the world, but behind every polished exterior is a deeper truth. And for many, that truth is a raw, aching tenderness that once reached for connection and got burned, so the heart, in its wisdom, closes. Not forever, but long enough to forget what it once knew, that feeling is not weakness, and shutting down is not healing. What you call numbness might actually be grief. Grief for the parts of you that weren't welcomed. Grief for the emotional self you had to lock away to stay safe. You see, the psyche doesn't numb out of spite, it numbs to protect. And that protection becomes so habitual that we start mistaking it for personality. Jung would call this repression, and repression has a cost: aliveness. Passion, joy, spontaneity, they're all casualties of the same war that buried your pain. The more you suppress your vulnerability, the more disconnected you become from your essence. And soon, you're not just numb to others, you're numb to yourself. That inner warmth still exists. It's just been hidden for so long you've forgotten how to feel it. You didn't choose to shut down because you were weak. You chose it because it worked. It kept you from falling apart when falling apart wasn't an option. But now you're older, you're safer. And the walls you built to protect yourself are now keeping you from the intimacy and aliveness your soul craves. Jung teaches us that healing isn't about forcing the heart open. It's about creating enough safety for the heart to open on its own. So if you've grown numb, don't rush to tear your defenses down. Begin by honoring why they were there in the first place. That numbness was sacred. It kept you going, but it's not who you are. Who you are is still underneath, waiting, not to be exposed, but to be embraced. Inside every adult who feels distant, emotionally detached, or numb, there is a child who once felt too much. A child who was too open, too sensitive, too alive, and who had no choice but to shut those parts down to survive. Carl Jung spoke of the divine child as a symbol of the potential for wholeness and transformation. But before this child becomes divine, it is often wounded deeply. And when that wound isn't seen, named, or held, it doesn't disappear. It simply retreats into the unconscious, From there, it shapes how we relate to the world. Detachment isn't a sign of emotional failure. It's often the mask the wounded child wears to avoid being hurt again. Behind the coldness, the silence, the withdrawal, there is often a story of abandonment, betrayal, or unmet need. When the wounded child goes unseen, they create the mask of detachment, a psychic shield that projects an image of control and invulnerability. Jung described this as a shadow dynamic, where repressed emotional truths get pushed into the unconscious and reappear in distorted forms. You might not remember crying as a child and being told to toughen up. You might not recall the subtle ways your joy, sadness, or curiosity were dismissed. But your body remembers, your nervous system remembers, and most importantly, the inner child within you remembers. That child didn't want to be distant, it wanted to be held, but when the world failed to offer safety, it learned that feelings were dangerous. So it stopped expressing them and started hiding behind the mask. The tragedy is that many people wear this mask for so long, they forget it's a mask. They come to believe, this is just who I am. I don't feel much, I don't need much, I don't get close. But this isn't personality, it's adaptation. Jung taught that individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are, requires turning inward to reclaim what we've exiled. That includes the child who once reached out and got nothing in return. The adult who feels empty is often the child who was never emotionally fed. And no amount of success, intellectualization, or self-discipline can substitute for the nourishment of being emotionally seen. To begin healing, you must recognize that your detachment isn't a flaw. It's a monument to your pain, and it deserves to be gently dismantled, not judged. When you stop pathologizing your numbness and start listening to it, everything changes. You realize that your emotional distance isn't a prison, it's a clue. A clue that somewhere along the way you made a sacred choice to protect your inner world. Now the invitation is not to rip that protection away, but to create a safer internal space where the wounded child doesn't need to hide. Jung said that we don't become enlightened by imagining light, but by making the darkness conscious. That includes making contact with the parts of us that learn to freeze, to silence, to detach. Healing isn't about becoming someone else. It's about remembering who you were before you had to protect yourself. The child is still in there, and they are not weak. They are waiting. Indifference is often misunderstood. It wears the costume of coolness, disinterest, or even cynicism. But underneath it, there's something much more tender. Carl Jung emphasized that repression isn't forgetting. It's a deliberate, unconscious exile. When someone seems indifferent, what we're usually witnessing is a repression so profound it's indistinguishable from apathy. But apathy is rarely real. No human being is born indifferent. We come into the world hungry for connection, overflowing with emotion, aching to be mirrored. So when that longing is unmet, when love is inconsistent or unsafe, we begin to suppress our desires. Repression, then, isn't the absence of feeling, it's the overmanagement of feeling. We don't stop caring, we bury our caring so deep that we forget where we put it. And when enough time passes, that burial starts to feel like personality. This is just how I am, we say. But it isn't. It's how you survived. What we call indifference often masks a deep well of grief. The psyche, when overwhelmed by pain it cannot express, will shut down rather than break. Repression is a strategy, one that once saved you from unbearable emotional overwhelm, but that protection comes at a cost. It separates you from yourself. Jung noted that everything we repress doesn't vanish. It becomes unconscious material, living in the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It's not dark in the moral sense. It is dark only because it is unseen. And when love, desire, tenderness, or anger is repressed, they do not disappear. They wait. They show up as fatigue, as emotional detachment, as chronic tension in the body, as difficulty crying even when your heart is breaking. What you're experiencing isn't indifference. It's a psychic freeze, a system still waiting for safety. Repression creates the illusion of stillness, but beneath the surface, the soul is aching to thaw. This illusion of indifference is often reinforced by culture. We are told that being unbothered is strength, that distance is power, but emotional. Suppression isn't a sign of maturity, it's often a sign of wounding. Jung observed that the more something is denied in consciousness, the more it gains strength in the unconscious. And so, while you may appear calm, composed, even stoic on the outside, inside, you may be roiling with unprocessed emotions. The tears you never cried, the rage you never screamed, the affection you never expressed, all of these become ghosts in your psychic house. You learn to function, to succeed, even to love in a muted way. But you feel the gap, the disconnection, the loneliness, and the deeper tragedy is this. The more you convince yourself that you don't care, the further you drift from the parts of you that always did. The ones that still do. The path to healing begins not with force, but with permission. Permission to feel what you were once forbidden to feel. To name the ache without trying to fix it. To stop pretending that your silence is peace, or that your indifference is truth. The repression of emotion isn't just a psychological mechanism. It's a soul-level plea for reconnection. Jung would say that true individuation involves reclaiming the very aspects of yourself that you disowned to survive. That includes your tenderness, your hunger for love, your sensitivity, once labeled weakness. When you begin to see your indifference not as who you are, but as a brilliant, tragic adaptation, you create space for reintegration. This isn't about becoming emotionally raw or exposed overnight. It's about softening, just enough to hear what's been waiting to speak. Underneath your numbness, there's a self still burning with life. You were never indifferent. You were exiled from your own truth. Emotional self-abandonment doesn't always look dramatic. It's not always loud or visible. Often it happens in subtle ways. Every time you say, "I'm fine," when you're not. Every time you swallow your truth to avoid tension. Every time you feel something stir within you and immediately silence. Carl Jung wrote that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. That means when we avoid our real emotional wounds, we end up creating suffering in disguise. Self-abandonment is exactly that, a quiet betrayal of the self that over time becomes an ache you can't name. You start to feel tired all the time. You lose your passion, your drive, your connection to joy. Your relationships begin to feel hollow, like performances. This isn't because you're broken. It's because the part of you that longs for authenticity has been silenced for so long, it no longer knows how to speak above the noise of survival. When you abandon yourself emotionally, a split occurs. In the psyche, one part of you continues to function, to work, to socialize, to manage responsibilities, but another part, the deeper part, begins to drift. Jung spoke of the danger of living only from the ego, the surface-level self that adapts to the outer world. Without connection to the inner self, the soul, you become a stranger to your own needs. You might find yourself over-accommodating others, constantly second-guessing your feelings or dismissing your intuition. Over time, this disconnection becomes normal. You learn to live from the outside in rather than the inside out. And while this adaptation may have helped you avoid rejection or punishment in the past, it slowly erodes your vitality. You lose access to the emotional compass that once told you what you loved, what you feared, and what truly mattered. That's the real cost. You stop recognizing your own aliveness. The world often rewards emotional self-abandonment. You might be praised for being easygoing, unbothered, or selfless. But beneath those compliments lies a dangerous message. that your value increases the more you disappear. Jung believed that the soul rebels against this kind of erasure, not with rage, necessarily, but with symptoms, exhaustion, anxiety, depression. These are not signs of weakness, they are protests. They are the psyche's attempt to alert you that something essential has been left behind. When you abandon your emotions, you don't just lose access to pain, you also lose access to joy, to creativity, to depth. The numbness spreads like fog, dulling even the most beautiful moments. And perhaps, worst of all, you begin to doubt yourself. You forget what you feel, what you need, what you love. The longer you stay disconnected, the harder it becomes to return. But even in that distance, the self you left behind is still waiting. Healing from emotional self-abandonment isn't about fixing yourself, it's about remembering yourself. It's about turning inward and saying, I'm still here, I matter, my feelings are valid. This is the beginning of self-reclamation. Jungian psychology teaches that the path to individuation, the journey toward wholeness, requires us to integrate the lost parts of ourselves. That includes the emotions we were once told were too much, too inconvenient, too shameful. The moment you begin to honor your emotional truth, no matter how small, you begin to bridge the divide. You no longer need to chase validation outside of yourself because you've re-established the inner connection. The cost of emotional self-abandonment is steep, but the reward of returning to yourself is greater. It is the return of your energy, your clarity, your capacity to love and be loved. You do not need to be someone else to be worthy. You just need to come home. When you're disconnected from yourself, every relationship becomes work. Not the kind of work that deepens intimacy or builds trust, but the kind that slowly wears you down. Carl Jung warned that if we do not become conscious of our inner dynamics, we will experience them as fate. In relationships, this plays out as confusion, resentment, and emotional fatigue. You find yourself over-explaining, over-giving, or overcompensating, just to feel seen. And yet, no matter how much you give, you still feel invisible. That's because no amount of external validation can fill the void left by your own abandonment. When you don't know who you are, you seek that answer in others, but people can't give you a sense of self. They can only reflect back what you show them, and if what you show is a performance, your best guess at being lovable, then what they reflect is not truly connection, it's just survival wearing a smile. Disconnection from the self creates a distortion in how we relate. You begin to measure love through the lens of utility. How needed am I? How agreeable, how helpful. Instead of sharing your truth, you assess what the other person wants to hear. Instead of setting boundaries, you tolerate discomfort just to avoid being alone. Jung called this dynamic the possession by the persona, the false self created to fit the world's expectations. But the cost is steep. You begin to resent the very people you once wanted to be close to, not because they are doing anything wrong, but because your role in the relationship is unsustainable. You are exhausted not just by the interaction, but by the constant effort to hide your needs. You suppress your anger, your sadness, your longings, until all you feel is numb. And ironically, in trying to preserve connection, you end up losing the most vital connection of all, the one with yourself. Emotional fatigue in relationships is a symptom, not a flaw. It's your psyche whispering that something isn't right. You weren't meant to spend your life managing other people's emotions while denying your own. Jungian thought reminds us that our relationships are mirrors of our unconscious selves. When you feel drained by another, ask, what part of me have I silenced here? Is it the part that longs to speak up, to ask for more, to say, this isn't enough? Emotional burnout often hides behind being the good partner, the good friend, the peacekeeper. But there is no peace in self-erasure. True connection can only exist where there is authenticity. If you are constantly performing, you're not in relationship, you're in role play. And no role, no matter how well crafted, can substitute the nourishment that comes from being seen as you truly are, without masks, without scripts, without fear of rejection. Healing this dynamic doesn't begin with other people. It begins with you. The relationships that drain you are often the ones where your truth has no space. So the first step is to reclaim that space within yourself. Start small. Notice when you're about to say yes, but mean no. Feel the tension in your body when you pretend to agree. Honor the discomfort that rises when you begin to speak your truth. This is the path back to relational energy, not through detachment or withdrawal, but through rooted presence. Jung emphasized that integration, wholeness, is a return to the self. And when you return to yourself, your relationships shift. You no longer need to earn love through sacrifice. You no longer mistake peace for silence. Instead, you invite others into the real you, and that kind of connection doesn't drain, it restores. Because when you are connected to yourself, love stops being a performance. It becomes a sanctuary. You weren't born cold. You were born open, nervous system soft, eyes wide, heart unguarded. You reached for warmth, connection, resonance. But if the world you were born into couldn't hold that openness, something inside of you began to retreat. Jung understood that the psyche protects itself through adaptation. You didn't stop needing love, you just stopped showing it. Because in a world where tenderness is met with chaos or indifference, vulnerability becomes dangerous. And slowly, without even realizing it, your warmth becomes buried under layers of defense. You call it being private, being strong, not caring. But underneath is a child who learned the cost of exposure. You didn't choose to be cold. You learned that coldness kept you safe. And now, even in the presence of love, you flinch. Because your body remembers what your mind tries to forget, that once love hurt. Safety isn't just the absence of danger, it's the presence of understanding. When your earliest experiences taught you that emotions led to punishment or abandonment, your nervous system encoded that lesson. You began to equate silence with peace, stillness with control, numbness with power. But those aren't true safety. They're survival. Jungian psychology speaks of the wounded child within us, the part frozen in time, still waiting for the world to feel safe enough to thaw. If warmth was once punished or ignored, your psyche builds a fortress. And while that fortress kept you alive, it also kept you alone. The irony is that what protected you as a child may now isolate you as an adult. You crave closeness, but recoil when it arrives. You want to be held, but don't trust the arms that offer. It's not that you're incapable of love. It's that love was once a battlefield. There's a deep grief in realizing how many times you had to betray your own softness just to survive. You were taught to disconnect from your emotions because no one modeled how to hold them. So you became your own silence, your own dismissal. And then, over time, the world began to confirm the story. People called you distant, unreadable, unfeeling. But they didn't see the 1,000 times you reached for comfort and found emptiness. They didn't see how early you had to grow armor. Jung wrote that what we repress doesn't disappear. It hides in the unconscious and waits. Your warmth isn't gone, it's waiting. Beneath the layers of emotional withdrawal is a capacity for depth, for empathy, for passion. But it won't come alive through force. It needs to feel safe. And safety isn't created by logic. It's created by presence, by learning to stay with yourself, even when the old fear rises like a wave. Healing from emotional shutdown isn't about forcing yourself to feel. It's about gently remembering that it's okay to feel. That your sensitivity isn't a liability, it's evidence of life. You don't need to fix yourself, you need to remember yourself. Remember that your distance was a response, not your essence. That your silence was learned, not chosen. And most importantly, that you're allowed to unlearn it. Carl Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires us to reclaim the parts of ourselves we exiled. Your warmth is not gone. It is intact, waiting for welcome. And as you begin to create that welcome within yourself, the walls start to soften. You may not know how to be open yet, but you're learning how to be safe. And safety is what allows your true self, not the cold, detached survivor, to finally come home. Numbness doesn't mean the feelings are gone. It means they've been driven underground. In Jungian terms, this is the shadow. Everything we repress, deny, or refuse to face within ourselves. When you disconnect from your emotions for long enough, they don't die. They ferment. Rage, grief, sorrow, fear, they remain in the psyche like exiled children still screaming in the basement of your being. But instead of hearing them clearly, they show up as irritability, fatigue, depression, and sudden bursts of emotion you can't explain. That numb surface is not peace. It's a frozen field beneath which storms rage. You may tell yourself you're calm, you're fine, you're unaffected. But your body knows the truth. The clenched jaw, the tension in your chest, the sighs you don't realize you're releasing. Numbness is the shadow's disguise, a mask you wear because the truth feels too overwhelming to hold. Many people assume numbness is the opposite of pain. It's not. Numbness is what happens when pain becomes too much to bear and the psyche shuts down to protect itself. Jung believed that our unconscious stores not only our traumas, but the emotional responses we were never allowed to feel. And when we push those feelings into the dark, we also sever our connection to vitality. To feel nothing is not safety, it's soul loss. Underneath the numbness often lies a deep well of grief. Grief for what we never received, for the parts of us that were never nurtured, for the life we've had to live while pretending to be okay. And alongside that grief, there is rage, the sacred fire of the self that had to be silenced. Rage at the betrayal, the abandonment, the injustice of having to shut down just to survive. These emotions don't make you broken. They make you human, and they need space to breathe. You might fear that if you open the door to these feelings, they'll consume you, that the rage will destroy everything, that the grief will never end. But Jung taught that what we avoid only gains more power in the dark. The longer these emotions go unlived, the more they haunt you, not as feelings but as symptoms, chronic exhaustion, disconnection, even physical illness. You weren't meant to carry unexpressed grief your whole life. You weren't meant to be a container for someone else's mistakes, and you certainly weren't meant to keep performing strength while your inner world is begging for release. The numb self is a survival adaptation, but it comes at a cost, and the price is often your aliveness. Reclaiming these lost emotions is not a collapse, it's a resurrection. It's not weakness to feel deeply, it's courage. And that courage brings you back into contact with the truth of who you are. The shadow of the numb self isn't just darkness. It's the container of everything sacred that had nowhere else to go. Your rage is sacred. Your grief is sacred. Your longing is sacred. You were never meant to banish them. You were meant to be in relationship with them. Jung believed that healing begins not when we become someone new, but when we integrate what we have exiled. The numb self begins to thaw when it is met with presence instead of judgment. You don't need to explain your feelings. You need to allow them. You don't need to justify your pain. You need to witness it. And in doing so, you make room for your soul to return. The one you silenced in order to survive. The one still, holding your fire, your sensitivity, your humanity. You are not empty. You are full of life that has not yet been lived. And that life is not gone. It's waiting for you to come back to it. Healing doesn't start with answers. It starts with listening, especially to the parts of yourself you were taught to ignore, the pain you minimized, the tears you swallowed, the voice inside that whispered, "This isn't okay," when the world demanded silence. Jung believed that the unconscious speaks through symbols, dreams, symptoms, and through the emotions we've buried alive. When you stop numbing yourself long enough to feel, even slightly, you'll hear them. The sigh before sleep, the tightness in your throat, the ache in your chest when someone asks how you're doing and you say fine. These are messages, not malfunctions. They're the language of the soul calling you back. The numbness wasn't a failure. It was your body's way of protecting you when it felt too dangerous to feel. But what once saved you now keeps you distant from life. Healing begins when you say, "I'm ready to hear what I once had to silence." Listening to your silenced. Parts is not always graceful. It can feel chaotic, overwhelming, raw. Memories you thought you forgot may resurface, not just in your mind, but in your body. Old heartbreak, childhood shame, the sound of someone raising their voice in a way that turns your whole nervous system on edge. Jung taught that healing involves the integration of these split-off fragments, the reconciliation between the conscious self and the unconscious wounds. That means not only hearing these parts, but treating them with reverence. You cannot rush them. You cannot fix them. You can only offer them space to exist. And slowly the layers of armor begin to fall away. What emerges isn't weakness, it's clarity. It's the return of your emotional truth, a truth that has always lived in your body, in your dreams, in your silence. It only needed you to stop running long enough to hear it speak. Listening doesn't mean wallowing, it means witnessing, without judgment, without trying to control what arises. Jung often emphasized the necessity of holding tension between opposites. Healing is not linear. One day you may feel full of strength, the next pulled back into despair. This is not failure, it's integration. You are learning to hold your sadness without drowning in it, to feel your anger without letting it destroy you, to grieve without collapsing into hopelessness. That is emotional maturity. That is soul work. When you listen to what was silenced, you break the pattern of abandonment that began long ago. You stop repeating the wound of being ignored, this time by refusing to ignore yourself. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. You begin to live in alignment with your truth, even if your voice shakes, even if it's just a whisper, because finally it's being heard. The silenced self doesn't demand a performance. It asks for presence. It doesn't want you to become perfect. It wants you to become real. And realness means honoring your inner world, even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient. Jung taught that what we resist persists, but what we bring to consciousness becomes healing. So ask yourself, what have I silenced to be accepted? What emotions have I disowned to feel safe? What parts of me have I labeled too much, too sensitive, too emotional, just because someone else couldn't hold them? Listening to these parts is not indulgence. It's reclamation. It's the slow, sacred process of unfreezing what had to be hidden. And with each breath of truth, each moment of presence, you send a signal to your psyche. You are no longer exiled. You are home. And that is where healing truly begins. You're not cold. This is a crucial truth that many of us miss because society often mistakes emotional distance for a personality flaw. But Carl Jung teaches us that emotional coldness is rarely a simple characteristic. It's a protective mechanism, a shield forged in early pain, a response to wounds too deep to express openly. When warmth once led to harm or rejection, the psyche learned to freeze those vulnerable parts, hiding them behind walls of detachment. What appears as coldness is actually the careful guarding of your most tender and precious pieces. These parts of you were too precious to lose, too fragile to risk exposing, so your soul created an armor, not to shut down completely, but to survive, to protect what remains most beautiful inside. Understanding this shift in perspective changes everything. You are not a fortress built from indifference, but a sanctuary built from survival and sacred self-preservation. The coldness is the language of a soul that has been hurt and yet refuses to surrender its light. Jung's idea of individuation, the process of becoming whole, asks us to honor even the frozen parts because they carry the deepest parts of our story. Beneath the numb exterior lies the wounded child, the dreamer, the lover, waiting for a safe moment to thaw. To reclaim your warmth, you don't need to force emotions that feel alien or unsafe. Instead, you begin by acknowledging that your coldness was once the only way to feel safe enough to carry on. This recognition is the first step in a long journey back to wholeness. As you begin to move past judgment and into compassion for yourself, you open a door for healing. You realize that the parts of you that seem distant or detached are actually calling out for connection with yourself first and then with others. Jung said that the shadow contains everything we deny about ourselves, and the cold parts of the psyche are no different. They hold grief, loss, and unexpressed love that yearn to be seen and embraced. When you listen without shame or blame, these frozen places begin to soften. You learn to honor your boundaries and express vulnerability on your own terms. This is how you transform coldness into strength, not by pushing through it, but by sitting with it, gently, patiently, lovingly. The most beautiful parts of you are those that once were hidden behind the cold exterior. They are the sparks of creativity, the capacity to love deeply, the yearning for authenticity that has never left. Protecting these parts was never about rejection of others. It was about protecting yourself until you could find your way back. Jung's teaching reminds us that healing is not about erasing the past, but integrating it. When you embrace your coldness as a sacred shield rather than a flaw, you begin to dissolve it from within. Your warmth returns, not as a flood, but as a steady flame. A light that shines not in spite of your wounds, but because of them. And that is the profound truth. You are not cold. You are beautifully, courageously whole. To truly heal, we must shift our perspective from self-judgment to self-compassion. Recognizing that what feels like coldness is a deeply rooted survival mechanism helps us stop fighting against ourselves. Carl Jung showed us that the psyche uses defense strategies to protect the vulnerable core. When we understand this, we begin to honor our emotional boundaries rather than shame them. This acceptance is the fertile ground where real transformation takes root. Healing does not mean abandoning your protective armor abruptly, but gently loosening it as you build trust within yourself and the world around you. The journey from emotional shutdown to authentic warmth is not linear. It is a dance between the shadow and the light within us. Jung teaches us that integration, not repression, leads to wholeness. This means allowing the frozen parts of ourselves to speak, to grieve, and to be seen without fear. It is in this courageous confrontation with our own vulnerability that we reclaim lost parts and discover profound strength. You are invited to meet yourself where you are, not where you wish you could be, and to hold your story with tenderness and patience. Relationships, too, change when we begin to thaw. As you reconnect with your own emotional truth, you invite others to do the same. The walls built from past wounds no longer dictate how you engage with intimacy and trust. Instead, you bring a newfound authenticity to your connections, deepening your capacity to love and be loved. This healing ripples outward, transforming not only your inner world, but also your relationships. The coldness that once isolated you becomes a bridge to genuine connection. Ultimately, you are not cold. You are beautifully human. You are a soul who has survived by learning to protect itself, and now you are ready to reclaim your warmth. This process is the essence of Jungian individuation, becoming whole by embracing every part of yourself. Your journey towards healing is a testament to your resilience and courage. Remember, the most profound transformation happens when we stop fighting ourselves and start listening deeply to what our soul truly needs. You are worthy of that warmth, and it's waiting patiently for you to come home.